On August 1st, the last submarine of the Black Sea Fleet was damaged. A great congratulations from the GUR of the Ukrainian Armed Forces and the SBU after the cancellation of the Navy parade in St. Petersburg.
It's listing heavily.
It's going over there. Look how huge that ship is. Russia? Attacks have begun on the Northern Pacific and Black Sea fleets of Russia. The SBU and the Ukrainian Armed Forces are attacking military airfields, nuclear submarines, and the Russian Navy. Everything is on fire.
It's sinking while I'm the ocean. There it goes again, look, oil depot.
Not a single Russian fleet can hide from Malyuk's naval drones and the SBU. We'll discuss all this with military analyst Roman Svitan right now.
Holy crap. Was that a hit?
Breaking news, friends, a reason for the SBU and our special services to attack Russia, military targets. Here's the most interesting news. The last submarine of the Black Sea Fleet has been damaged. A source in the GPU's investigation committee claims that the Russian Black Sea Fleet now has only one submarine left, the Kolpino. It was the only submarine capable of carrying out combat missions. And now it has been damaged, according to the GPU's investigation committee. A military airfield was attacked last night, and the Butulinovka air base was also targeted, as well as the 899th Guards Assault Aviation Arshan Regiment. For several days in a row, the Ukrainian Air Force has been attacking military factories in Russia. This time, the Tambov powder plant in the city of Kotovsk was hit.
Damn, I can't keep up. There. Everything's on fire. Maybe it's the factory. The factory? Take a look at what's over there. We're screwed.
Last night, the permanent deployment point of Russian militants in Marino-Kursk region was attacked. That was the base of one of the Russian airborne forces units. The number, about a company. The SBU and special services are preparing attacks on the Pacific Fleet and the Northern Fleet of the Russian Federation. The Washington Post published an article saying that the SBU and Ukrainian special services will continue their special operations. We'll discuss all this with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan. Roman Grigorievich, welcome.
Thank you. Wishing everyone good health.
Very important information about the submarines of the Black Sea Fleet. Here is the Kolpino, which for some reason is now reported as damaged by the main intelligence directorate.
Damage. The Russians have 3 submarines left in the Black Sea, so-called launches, which can launch caliber missiles from underwater. So if it's damaged, there really is damage. Why? Because the General Staff hasn't confirmed it yet. So right now we're talking based on information from a Telegram channel. Once the General Staff confirms it, then we can say that another caliber carrier can be counted as a loss. Well, a submarine can be damaged in various ways. In principle, if it's reconnaissance, that means either informants or external influence using UUVs, using underwater torpedo devices. We do have so-called underwater drones. Both Toloka and Marichka are carrying out combat missions. And of course, there's also the possibility of targeting them when they surface. That is, submarines approach places like Novorossiysk. They have certain docks there, technical services, and damage could have been inflicted there as well. That's why, of course, this is very important for us. For example, damaging the submarines specifically. Submarines, because in the Black Sea at the moment, we can't really track them properly. That is, while we can see Russian surface ships well, if a submarine dives deep, it's very difficult. It's possible in principle, but for that, you need entire air operations, by the way, including the use of certain hydro buoys, in other words, with specific means to detect the submarine, and even then, sinking it is very difficult. That's why it's optimal to damage it, of course, while it's on the surface, and even better in the area of Novorossiysk. Why has Novorossiysk been waiting for action from our army for so long? The intelligence services seem to have forgotten about it, about the Novorossiysk direction, most likely because there's an oil terminal nearby. And right now, the intelligence services are as afraid of any Russian oil infrastructure as they are of fire. In other words, Ukrainian intelligence services are quicker to steer clear of oil facilities than the Russians themselves. So now, of course, the question is for our army. That is, our armed forces of Ukraine are not as tightly tied to certain power structures as the intelligence services are. They mostly act as their errand boys. But the army is already carrying out combat missions and understands for itself that if they don't destroy, say, Russian submarines in Novorossiysk, and naturally if they don't also hit the oil terminal in Novorossiysk, then in the end they'll be the ones who have to die. The intelligence services aren't the ones dying. It's the soldier who dies on the front line of combat, while the intelligence services, instead of destroying hydrocarbon targets under Malyuk and Budanov sanctions, just throw up their hands and say, oh dear, oh no, we can't, we weren't able to, and so on and so forth. That's why the military now has to take on this task, the destruction of Russian hydrocarbon infrastructure, including the bases of Russian submarines. There are just too many questions. There are just too many questions. They are not fulfilling their direct official duties. Destroying Russian military targets is the main task of the armed forces of Ukraine. That's the army. Honestly, right now, this is Magyar's main task, to use long-range strike capabilities, mostly drones, to destroy, including the enemy's rear position. And the special services should be dealing with internal problems, and we have more than enough of those. They received orders not to strike Russian oil and gas infrastructure. Of course, we are very grateful that they once lent a helping hand to the armed forces of Ukraine, but in the end, it's time to focus on internal enemies and internal issues. That's regarding the special services. And as for Magyar, believe me, he'll handle it. I think Magyar would send anyone who orders him not to strike a military target, such as, for example, the oil and gas sector of Russia, straight in the direction of the Russian warship. Of course, they'll come up with something for the 12th offer congratulations, but right now, after the special services have shown themselves in a very bad light because they failed to fulfill their direct duties, they didn't arrest those in contact with the Russians, they didn't arrest the person who gave the order not to strike Russian oil refineries. In other words, they failed in their task. So let the army handle it. Since the special services have already shifted into the mode of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, meaning they've moved closer to that old, still Soviet school, then at least let the armed forces of Ukraine do the work now. All the more so because it's long overdue for the special services to, let's put it mildly, change their focus. The main intelligence directorate should not be subordinate to the Minister of Defense, especially not a civilian one. The main intelligence directorate should be subordinate to the general staff of the armed forces of Ukraine, and within it should be the same special operations forces. In other words, it's a unified system, and what should they be doing there? Destroying Russian military targets, including the oil refining sector. The security service of Ukraine also should no longer exist. Why? Because, for example, engaging in political investigations for those in power, the so-called elites, is something we don't need. After all, we are a democratic country, a European one. That's why all these KGB-style habits need to be completely eliminated. I'm talking about those habits. And the political investigators from the SBU who are freed up should be sent to the armed forces of Ukraine, to the infantry. That would be the optimal solution. The only structure that should remain and actually function is counterintelligence. But again, counterintelligence needs to be brought under the general staff, that is placed under the command of the armed forces of Ukraine. This would become the main intelligence directorate, which would include counterintelligence as part of it. That's it. We shouldn't have a main intelligence directorate under the Ministry of Defense, nor should we have the SBU. In other words, it simply shouldn't exist. The army should be focused on combat missions, that is, systematic work to destroy Russia's military economy and Russian military targets. This is the optimal option for us. Right now, we can't afford to support intelligence agencies that, to put it mildly, aren't even catching mice inside the country. That's the least of it. Roman Grigorievich, the airfield has been attacked. Butulinovka. The 899th Guards Assault Aviation Orsha Regiment. There have been explosions, there is damage. Let's discuss this. Well, it's an assault regiment. That means there are Russian Sukhoi stationed there, Russian Sukhois, a large number of them. We've hit Butulinovka several times, but we've never completely taken it out. Well, in principle, it's practically impossible to completely take out any airfield unless you have the ability to get to the runway, for example, with bombers and drop free-fall bombs, mainly concrete piercing ones with some really, really good bombing. If that's not entirely possible, then at most you can potentially damage, especially if it involves drones, the airfield's essential technical equipment, and any vehicles currently present, including various Russian aircraft. I think within a couple of days, the general staff, after decoding operational monitoring data and analyzing satellite images, which our intelligence will obtain, will report the actual losses. But Butulinovka is one of the tactical aviation airfields that will be destroyed if possible at the very least. The only thing is, of course, they now realize that we're starting to reach such distances, so they'll begin to disperse their tactical aviation. Attack aircraft are tactical aviation. Roman Grigorievich, we've just noticed that we're intensively attacking military airfields and in general facilities of Russia's military industrial complex. Just in the last 15 days, 1 military space reconnaissance unit was attacked, 3 airfields, 13 enterprises connected to the military industrial complex. An additional 4 were attacked again within the month, and 3 more airfields. The focus is on chemical plants and ammunition production. How do you assess the work that's been done specifically over the past 2 weeks? And here, we can actually praise and commend our brave army, because the vast majority of these impactful strikes are indeed the commendable work of our very own dedicated troops, the courageous armed forces of Ukraine, who have demonstrated remarkable resilience and strategic prowess. Mainly it's them. In other words, the drone forces, the air forces are involved, and the Navy as well. That is, they have their own fleet in this regard. Recently, Magyar has proven himself very well in commanding the drone forces, meaning there is some significant work happening within the command system. So this is all precisely the systematic work of the army, which targets military facilities. And here the key word is systematic. This word, systematic. Systematic work. Why? Because the special services swoop in, peck at something, run off, peck at something else, show off a bit, and then run off again. But the army, if it moves slowly, you will come down from the mountain and take the whole Russian herd. That's how the army operates. That's why it's ideal when the armed forces are fully formed and they don't need anyone else at all. Within the armed forces, there should be their own special services, which must carry out combat missions according to the combat charter and the oath that servicemen and officers at the very least give to the people of Ukraine, and not listen to politicians who tie the hands of the special services. But the special services, like little lapdogs, run errands for the politicians. The army doesn't work like that. The army can clean itself out thoroughly from within and even twist the heads off politicians who are working for the enemy. So this was actually a precise operation. The destruction of powder factories, the destruction of airfields, aircraft on the airfields, the destruction of production facilities, especially electronics. So in just a couple of weeks, probably about 12.5, as we've been discussing almost every other day, about 12.5 major significant Russian targets have been destroyed. The only thing left now is to continue, not with Malyuk's or Budanov's sanctions. Forget about both Malyuk, Budanov, and the sanctions. They won't be targeting the oil refineries anymore. We need to keep destroying the Russian hydrocarbon industry using the capabilities of unmanned systems. There is such an opportunity. Magyar needs to prove himself. If even Magyar fails, like the intelligence services did, then I guess the old guys will have to take care of this, rally their friends, and simply burn down the Russian hydrocarbon sector from the inside, so to speak, from within Russia.
Dear audience, please like this video. In the comments, write a few kind words in support of Ukraine and let us know where you're watching from. We work for an audience all over the world so that people know the truth about Russian aggression, about Russia's war against Ukraine. That's why every like, every comment, and every subscription is priceless. I'm grateful to you for that. Roman Grigorievich last night, and actually for several days in a row, we have been attacking military factories in Russia. Right now, the Tambov powder plant in the city of Kotovsk is under attack. What have we analyzed? So, the Tambov powder plant produces pyroxylin powders for all types of small arms and artillery weapons, including systems of various calibers used by ground forces, the Navy, and aviation. It is also the main supplier of armor-piercing sub-caliber rounds for tank artillery. Roman Grigorievich, the floor is yours.
Any powder plant is very difficult to hit and completely put out of commission. Well, at least it's practically impossible to do so with drones. So the fact that we managed to hit the Tambov powder plant today, well, it's good that we hit it. But in reality, we didn't cause any significant damage. Why is that? Because of the underground. Some of the workshops are underground. Any powder plant, when it was designed back in the Soviet Union, was supposed to withstand a nuclear strike. How is any drone supposed to reach it? The only way to hit a powder plant is with a warhead of about half a ton, a tandem one, meaning to break open the underground chambers, get inside to where the gunpowder is actually produced, and detonate there. This is only possible with the use of either cruise missiles with a very long range. At the moment, we don't have anything like that. Even if we get Taurus missiles or something like Taurus, Storm Shadow, or Scalp, well, Scalp has a range of 250 kilometers, Taurus 500 kilometers. We still won't be able to reach all the factories. Most of the Russian powder plants are located closer to the Urals, and that's already nearly 2,000 kilometers away. Right now, what's especially important for us is ballistics. In other words, we need a ballistic missile program. And if it hasn't been launched yet, then the executive branch, which has been sitting there for 7 years and still hasn't started it, needs to be kicked out as fast as possible. Ballistics isn't about hitting targets 50 or 100 kilometers away, like the Tochka-U or the HIMARS with their M30 and M31 rockets do now. It's about reaching 2,500 kilometers. We need to be able to reach the Urals. So we're talking about serious ballistic missile programs, the kind that were destroyed back in the day during Poroshenko's time and then buried even deeper by the current government. So at this point, the executive branch has been in power for 7 years, and we still don't have a single ballistic missile. Meanwhile, during this time, the Saudis used our facilities and their own money to produce the ROM missiles and took them for themselves. So the capability exists, which means there was simply no will and no funding allocated for these programs. And that means, in pure terms, during combat operations. Article 111, treason. Why are all these people still not behind bars? Again, these are questions for the security services who are busy with God knows what, but not their actual job. So this is a major problem for us right now. But I think the security services will listen to us and finally start doing their job by identifying the shortcomings in the planning of the ballistic missile production program. Why? Because without ballistic missiles, we definitely won't win this war. Moreover, ballistics, the best, most interesting, and most effective air defense for us right now is ballistic missiles, strange as that may sound. Because any strike on our territory, if a ballistic missile is sent in response toward Moscow, toward the Kremlin, and it's only 500 kilometers away, you don't need to reach the Urals. It's just 500 kilometers. How long is that? With a ballistic missile, that's basically 5 to 10 minutes of flight time. And this was the optimal option, but all our authorities in recent times have simply ruined it. In other words, they didn't allow the possibility of striking Moscow in response to attacks on Kyiv, Kharkiv, Dnipro, Zaporizhia, Odessa, Mykolaiv, basically all of Ukraine. So there's a big question here. I'll say it again, though, of course, there are supposedly no questions for the special services. They need to be handed over to the armed forces of Ukraine. That's already a death sentence for them. They're completely useless. The question is for the executive branch. Because if we don't replace the executive branch now, we'll never have ballistic missiles at all. And we'll fight to the last Ukrainian if we don't strike Moscow and don't destroy Russia's hydrocarbon industry. The most effective and impactful sanction is precisely the direct and immediate destruction of Russian oil refineries, Russian terminals, and Russia's entire oil and gas extraction industry. In other words, this comprehensive approach should be considered incredibly important because here's a very good and compelling point. So we talk about it, right? We made it to Tambov, set off some kind of fireworks there. Did we destroy the plant? No. Then what was the point of doing all that in the first place? Why waste drones that made it there, losing a ton of drones and decoys on the way to Tambov? So why do it? Maybe it would have been easier to just hit Novoshakhtinsk, the Russian oil refinery in Novoshakhtinsk, which specifically supplies diesel, gasoline, and aviation kerosene to the Russian army. That's the question. This is just for show. These displays, nobody needs them anymore at this point. Either this government will work specifically for Ukraine's victory, or it can go the same way as the previous Yanukovych government. They're sitting there comfortably in Moscow, bad-mouthing each other. That is, Yanukovych probably dragged some of them along with him somewhere in Barvika or wherever they're staying. In other words, they can't. You can't. And I'm addressing the executive branch now. If you can't do it, then clear the way, for heaven's sake. If you don't have the brains to accomplish certain tasks, to set them, to supervise them, and to deliver what we need, then clear the way. Let people who actually understand these issues step in. Why? Because otherwise we'll all end up badly, not just those in power. The authorities, of course, will grab their hard-earned, painstakingly accumulated property and scatter in all directions. Ukraine will be lost, and Ukrainians will be lost. Because in this kind of situation, if we don't strike where we need to strike, we simply won't exist anymore. We'll wear ourselves down in this sense. And the blame for this will lie with the executive authorities who will scatter in all directions. So the question now is for the authorities, specifically for those people who are directly responsible for these issues. Well, as for Tambov getting a little scorched over there, that was just to scare the crows, at least for now. There were strikes before that. We discussed this with you at some point. There was a good strike on the fuel and lubricants depot in Engels. Almost the entire depot burned down. The only thing left there are the underground reservoirs. Several tens of thousands of tons of fuel, aviation kerosene. The so-called Russian depots, they still need to get to those. But again, you can only reach them either with intelligence operatives or with ballistic missiles, because those caissons are located in Kursk caves and you can't just get to them easily. Although, of course, you can always try.
Roman Grigorievich, when we attacked the Iskander ballistic missile launchers in Bryansk, afterwards I read that many military analysts wrote, and there were even video materials saying that in this way Ukraine was testing or trying out our ballistic missiles, that a number of airfields were attacked by Ukrainian ballistic missiles. These were tests, and among other things, these launchers could have been attacked by Ukrainian ballistic missiles. What is your opinion on this kind of information?
Like in total nonsense. Let me explain why. For several weeks, we've been tearing this executive branch apart with 6-story curses because in the 7th year, they still don't have any ballistics. And most likely they just threw something into the information stream like, no, we just messed ourselves right here. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So what are Clean Sea? It's 50 kilometers from our border. What kind of ballistics? The kind we need. Clean Sea is 50 kilometers away, and an M31 rocket launched from a HIMARS can reach there. Ballistics, well, you could say that's ballistics. No questions there. But what we need is a ballistic missile with a range of 500 kilometers to reach Moscow and a warhead of half a ton, not the kind of warhead that exploded in Clean Sea. Well, we've seen the information flow about that. There was no more than 50 kilograms of explosives there. So that's about the 90-kilogram warhead, so-called. That's exactly the M31 missile. What about our own ballistic missiles? Well, if you consider that HIMARS are ours, and M31 missiles are already ours if we paid for them. Yes, no questions there. That's our ballistic missile made in America. That's why there are serious questions for the executive branch, especially when they try to pull the wool over our eyes, claiming they've already tested something somewhere. If they had actually tested a real ballistic missile, at least in the configuration I'm talking about, a half-ton warhead with a 500-kilometer range, Moscow would already be burning. We would have already seen it. Lenin himself would be running around Red Square in shock, in his underwear and a t-shirt, shouting, "Oh, what are you doing? Have you lost your minds?" But obviously that's not happening. So all this nonsense, this executive branch of ours claiming they're testing something somewhere, well, they can test something in their own bathtub if they want by doing certain things. That's it. They can't do anything else. It's obvious. They're pure-blooded impotents.
Roman Grigorievich, so there was a law about the permanent deployment point of Russian militants in Mariino-Kursk region. According to military analysts, that's where, or was where, the permanent deployment point of one of Russia's airborne forces units was located, with about a company in strength. We're expecting some good news in the General Staff's report. What do you think?
Well, the permanent deployment points of Russian paratroopers, right now, by the way, there are some pretty serious battles going on in Terpino. Mostly, it's either Crimean paratroopers or those from Ivanovo. So basically, they took all the men from Ivanovo, the city of brides, and told them, you're going to be paratroopers. Well, and all the girls from Ivanovo have already joined the LGBT community. What else are they supposed to do if there are no men left? So naturally, the permanent deployment point that's not far from Tyutkino, that's Rilsk. How many times have we talked about hits there? Mainly Rilsk, Elgov, that's the right bank of the Sim. They were working on Marinka, it's the same thing. Recently, a bridge, just last night, a bridge was taken out not far from Tyutkino. So there's serious work going on there, army work to destroy the enemy's rear positions. That's what they call the army's rear. So either permanent deployment points or headquarters, command systems are being identified and tracked. Moreover, you can clearly see systematic work being done in the Kursk direction right now. Every branch and type of troops is involved, except maybe the sailors. Although if there are Marines there, then most likely the sailors are there too, it turns out. So all branches of the military are specifically working in the Kursk direction, and this systematic approach is producing results. Starting from the destruction of headquarters with a large number of Russians, and recently, as we discussed, a Russian Su-35 was taken out. This also happened in the same direction. This is, so to speak, the full package of combat tasks being carried out by the armed forces of Ukraine. You could say that the summer of 2025 is the summer when the Ukrainian army is fully coming into its own. Truly, in every sense. Well, the only thing we don't have right now, the one thing is space. That is, we don't have so-called space forces. Although I think we'll get to that in due time as well, because we have practically everything else from submarines to aviation.
Kirilo Budanov stated that the cooperation between Russia and North Korea is already having a direct impact on the war in Ukraine. In particular, the head of the GUAR emphasized that Pyongyang is actively supplying Moscow with weapons and MLRS artillery systems. As an example of such cooperation, Budanov cited the North Korean KN-23 or HN-23 ballistic missiles. He noted that the first batch of these missiles used against Ukraine was of extremely low quality. Almost half of them exploded in the air or veered significantly off target. However, thanks to the help of the Russians, these missiles were greatly improved. This is a direct result of the joint work of specialists from both regimes. And accordingly, this causes great concern, Budanov said. Roman Grigorievich, please.
Budanov is definitely right. At first, the task for the KN-23, which is a Korean missile, was simply to hit the planet, but they couldn't even accomplish that. They exploded in the air. They couldn't even hit the planet. And then when they started bringing these missiles into our theater of military operations, most likely Chinese and Russian engineers got involved, refined the missile, and now it's at the level of the Iskander, maybe even a bit further. I think it can go up to 200 kilometers farther than the Iskander, up to 700 kilometers for some of its variants. And its warhead is 150 kilograms heavier. So basically, the missile has become quite dangerous now after skilled specialists got involved in its production. The thing is, they only got involved in the production of this missile a few months ago, or, well, maybe last year. Meanwhile, our government has been sitting around for 7 years and still can't manage to create this missile, especially since we had already created it before, at least to recreate it. I mean, the same Grom 2 that we had and then handed over to the Saudis. So they can't even manage that. Look at the North Korean donuts. They don't even finish eating them, probably because they have to give them all to Kim Jong-il since he's about to be overthrown. But in reality, of course, they can't do it. They don't participate in the world economy. They're completely cut off by sanctions. Nevertheless, they have ballistic missiles capable of reaching, if we had them, Moscow, and that's 700. Moscow is 450 kilometers away. And these are about 600 or 700 kilometers. Yet they managed to do it. So the North Korean donut was able to make these missiles. But our Minister of Defense, our donut, couldn't make these missiles. So they're kind of the same. One is just a bit wider than the other, but one has missiles and we don't. That's a big problem. That's why Budanov is right in the sense that he provides accurate information. Yes, but what's the use of it, of this information? This information doesn't really make any difference for us. It's neither here nor there. If Budanov were saying right now that the missile production in North Korea had been destroyed, now that would be something. That would be a real result. So the point isn't about Budanov. The issue is a systemic one, our systemic mistake in building up the armed forces. It shouldn't be like this, where we have about a dozen security agencies, a dozen of them, and they're all just drifting around, each doing their own thing. During wartime, everyone should be under a single command. The GUAR should be under the command, not of our Ponchik, but under the chief of the general staff. It should ultimately be under Gnatov's command, and then we won't be listening to or even hearing Budanov at all. Frankly, we shouldn't be hearing from him. So tell me, please, who is the head of the GRU of the Russian general staff? No one knows who he is. Why is that? Because that information is classified. But you hear Budanov everywhere. So this is not the right path. It's not the way intelligence should operate. That is, they should be carrying out combat missions. Exactly. And by the way, why is it that the Russians have the GRU, the main intelligence directorate of the general staff, while we have the main intelligence directorate of the Ministry of Defense? Do you think they're a fool sitting over there or something? But here we've created a certain structure just to siphon off money and drift around aimlessly. That's what it's called. Bring them in. The GUR needs to be brought under the general staff, under the GS, under NATO at the moment. He'll quickly set them straight and assign them where they need to go and what they need to do. It's the same story with the security service. I've already talked about this. Counterintelligence should go to the GUR and the general staff, and everyone else should be integrated into the armed forces of Ukraine. We don't need political surveillance in a democratic country. They run around with folders, opening files on everyone. Who said what? Who gave a dirty look to these office rats and so on and so forth. So they have this problem getting involved in things that aren't their business, to say the least. But regarding North Korea, concrete decisions need to be made right now. It's not far away, really not far at all. North Korea and Ukraine share a border. Don't be shocked now. The Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic borders North Korea along the Tonkaya and Tumanaya rivers. Sorry, the Tumanaya River. That's why this issue needs to be addressed right there, where, for example, our intelligence services should be working. Specifically, this issue, the re-establishment of the Far Eastern Ukrainian People's Republic and engaging in hostilities with the North Korean donut along the Tumanaya River. That should be our objective. We'll see, because anything can happen. Just recently, a North Korean ship landed in the wrong place. Well, ships don't just fall for no reason. That's a whole other matter too.
Dear audience, as always, please give this video a like. In the comments, write a few kind words in support of the armed forces of Ukraine as well as Ukraine itself. We work for an audience all over the world so that people know the truth about Russian aggression. And that's why every like, every subscription and every comment from you is invaluable. I will be grateful to you for all of this. Together with the well-known military analyst Roman Svitan, we work 3 times a week on my YouTube channel, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Roman Grigorievich, thank you so much. As always, see you this Friday.